Miss Reed. Hi, Miss Reed. Just before you speak, if you wouldn't mind muting. Sorry, everything got really silent. If you wouldn't mind muting your side of it until you're ready to speak, that'd be great. Thank you. Press that and it'll turn green and you'll be ready to go. Okay. Once,
Okay,
and I'll turn
green.
green.
Got
and
it.
we'll be able to speak.
Okay.
Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Brian Finley. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson. We're very grateful to all of you for making the time to come out and join us for this conversation. I think it's quite clear that recent events, if you are not convinced that chemical security is not a compelling global issue, a survey of recent events will suggest otherwise. Whether it's events in Malaysia, in the United Kingdom, and certainly in Syria, we can see that despite the fact that nuclear weapons often grab the Hollywood headlines, grabs public attention and most often policymaker attention, I think that the compelling evidence suggests that our attention should rightly be equally directed towards the menace, indeed the continuing menace of chemical weapons and the threat that they pose. At the same time that we're seeing a growing incidence of chemical weapons use, we're also, I think, increasingly becoming alarmed at what we are seeing as signs of an evidence in the rollback against the norm of use, acquisition, and such around chemical weapons. And it is for these two, I think, very compelling reasons that we are extremely pleased to be hosting this discussion here with all of you this afternoon. We're pleased, certainly not just to be hosting it, but to be hosting it alongside the International Center for Chemical Safety and Security. Christophe, thank you so much for for throwing in and joining us, a man that needs no introduction, I suspect, to anyone in this room. Christophe serves as the president of ICSS, and we are very grateful to him and his team for helping pull this discussion together. And Christophe, I will say that Stimson looks very much forward to continuing this relationship and working closely with you in the future as well. You'll be hearing more from our Master of Ceremonies, Richard Cupit, shortly. Rick joins us, of course, from the U.S. Department of State, and he joins us in directing our proliferation program, preventing proliferation program. Thank you. Here at the Stimson Center. Not surprisingly, for those of you who know Rick's recent history, Rick focuses a lot on the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1540, and in that regard, works really across chem, bio, and nuke, but he also directs our chemical security project here at the Stimson Center. And in that regard, I want to thank the sponsor of that work, who is joining us remotely from Global Affairs Canada, Kim Reed. Hello, Kim. Kim directs the Chemical and Biological Security Program at Global Affairs Canada as part of the Global Partnership. And I want to say not just a word of thanks to Kim for the sponsorship of our work, but really for Canada's, I would say, leadership, as other international attention, I think, has been diverted to other pressing global issues around the world. I think it's safe to say that the government in Ottawa has really maintained true and stayed steadfast in their global leadership, constantly investing not just their time but their resources as well, in reminding us that chemical weapons are still out there and that they are still a threat. And for lest anyone in the room thinks there's any favoritism in me bringing this particular issue up, I think, Dave, you would vociferously agree that Canada really is and has been a global leader on this. So here's the order of battle for the rest of the afternoon for those of you that are keeping score. We're going to invite a couple of folks up here to give some early framing remarks for the discussion, and then we're going to turn to two panels, for one focusing on broad standards and the other looking a little bit down the road at new tools of engagement, particularly directed towards industry. Maybe Kim, if you are willing, we'll give you the floor here first. As I mentioned, Kim directs the Chem Bio program out of Global Affairs Canada. She works for a not very nice person that all of you will know, Trevor Smith, in this room, but Kim is just the opposite. She is deeply dedicated not to just to this work, but Kim, thank you for joining us here today, and let me give you the floor, ma'am. We can indeed. Yes, we can. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Very good. Trevor, Kim, did you want to say anything else at this point, or? Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim and Trevor, both. I'm sorry you can't see us. For the record, Kim, you look fabulous on our big screen here in the conference. Trevor, you could use a little work, but no, in seriousness, thank you again for not just for joining us, but also for your leadership in this issue within the global partnership, and indeed for the leadership of Canada, more importantly. Our co-host here today, as I mentioned at the outset, needs really no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyhow, just for fun. Ambassador Christophe Pachurai is the president of the International Center for Chemical Safety and Security. He is a career diplomat. He is the former Polish permanent representative to the OPCW. He knows his way around fora like this. He knows his way around industry, and we could think of no one more ideally suited than the ambassador to help us convene this discussion moving forward. His bio, I think, is available at the back of the room, and you can all learn the most intimate details of the ambassador as you peruse that. But Ambassador, thank you again for making this happen, and I give you the dais, sir.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and I'm very happy. When I'm coming to Washington, D.C., I'm always coming to load my batteries. You know. For the last 30 years, I'm coming a few times a year, and it's always very happy. Thank you, Brian, for co-hosting, for inviting us, and I'm very grateful for our Canadian friends, for Kim and for Trevor, for being with us also today. I respect extremely Canadian participation and support and leadership in these areas for CBR and non-proliferation for many, many years. And also, I'm so happy to see few faces here which are extremely important for this process around the world. There is Ami from the back. I know how long you know me, you know, and she was one of my mentors from State Department for many years already, but especially now in recent years, I see Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. We made together a couple of years ago in 2011. She made an important trip to Poland, to Warsaw, to a small town in Tarnów, and we started this global process for chemical security from this meeting, which followed then as a global meeting in 2012 in Poland by OPCW, and when center was established. And today also we have here a very important person, a true leader in these areas, David Wolf from Homeland Security, who is absolutely, for me, a leader in this, making this process on law enforcement and in making the process of chemical security. And I learned so much from attending every year the U.S. Summit on Chemical Security. And to U.S. audience, to many of you, I can tell in a secret that what we are doing to much extent, we are simply trying to operationalize and internalize the lessons that I learned from working with U.S. colleagues on these issues. Therefore, again, I know most of you also personally, and it gives me personally an enormous sense of cooperation and your friendship. I see also the person, I'd like to say the last words to Rick Capit, because Rick in this area spent also many, many years. He is one of the father of UN 1540 and was very much behind it, you know, to make it very, very practical tool and very important tool, maintaining this Therefore, Ulrike, again, thank you very much for being with us. My friends, we came here with Ambassador Vaidotas Verba, who was previous leader of OEC in Kiev and who was one of the innovators in renovating international agenda. I would tell that he was one of the very few people who understood the international organizations in recent forms require serious reshape to be more practical. And he was doing this in Ukraine with this especially program on chemical security. I hope that he would brief us about that. But I'm also happy to see here my young colleague, not anymore young, Piotr from Russian embassy. We worked together in OPSW for a couple of years, and I'm very glad that you found time and joined us. I remember our discussions, and still when it was consensus at OPSW. And some of you mentioned the conference of the review conference. Maybe you remember I was chairing the third review conference, and we produced the final document and consensus final document as the only final document in last 15 years for any disarmament treaty, you know. But it was enormous work done by all of us, and I would speak about that now. If you allow me, I would like to challenge you and by a very simple statement. We are outdated on the perception of chemical threat. This is my co-statement, which I came here to take this to U.S. audience, to international audience in Washington. I believe that you are still the most relevant audience we can discuss this issue. So we still think through a concept of use traditional chemical weapons and concentrate efforts to stem chemical weapons proliferation and achieve chemical disarmament. It is not anymore an option in chemical area. The chemical threat could be further aggravated by cyber attacks against chemical and critical infrastructure installations. Today, counter could be a real weapon as well. Therefore, we have to attack the immediate challenges of growing threat of use of chemical weapons and toxic industrial chemicals as means of warfare or terror with innovative, future-looking approaches. My main message is chemical threat is global, in reach, and requires global and consensus approaches. Since the Syrian crisis in 2013, it was exactly the year when you have the review conference and exactly when I finished my job at OPSW, followed by use of chemical weapons around the world, but not traditional chemical weapons. Therefore, everything could be today chemical weapon, and many of you know that. Many of us had to re-examine our thinking about mechanism of chemical weapons disarmament and process of chemical threat reduction. Few questions arise in this respect. How integrated the world community should be to achieve a complete chemical disarmament once the global consensus in the relevant international structures is failing? How much new regulations and decisions are right to support the world safe from chemical weapons? Many people combine these two distinctive processes. One is how to achieve global chemical disarmament, and another process is how much new regulations and decisions are needed to make this process again consensus or effective. Many people combine these two distinctive processes in one. They favor both maintaining existing disarmament system, even without consensus, and to strengthening with new regulations. The other oppose both existing chemical disarmament system and new regulations. When you go to, I was at OPSW, this 4th review conference, and it was, believe me, in a nutshell, it's a co-problem. Nobody's against chemical disarmament. Nobody. I talked to every delegation. I had long discussion with Syrian delegation. With every delegation, everybody supports this. But they have this two dilemma. Whether we have to have the system on complete disarmament once it was developed, or it should be supported by new regulations, and the special conference in June was such an attempt to reinvigorate the system with new regulations which were not supported by consensus. There is a better way, my friends, And this is my second message to you. There's a better way. We propose to move towards global chemical architecture, where OPSW of 3.0, I call it OPSW 3.0, and the national and regional efforts to enhance chemical safety security go into the center of global integrated process. We call this global chemical architecture. And this would reinvigorate chemical disarmament system and allow to bring new regulations or solutions, and they can coexist together. Where we try to compete existing system, add to existing system simply new regulations, will never make this consensus. Therefore, in this global chemical architecture, we could work together to exclude chemical activity from conflict, and we can develop and build global multi-stakeholder consensus that chemistry is used only for peaceful purposes. This is the core requirement. Today is not enough to prohibit chemical weapons, because what is chemical weapon? Everything could be chemical weapon today. Fundamental requirement is that we agreed, everyone, that chemicals should be taken out of conflict, political conflict, military conflict, any conflict. And when I talk about this to all delegations at OPSW, and when we are doing this for last 2 years, 3 years, nobody opposes this. Therefore, after 100 years of chemical weapons prohibition, we have to agree that for humankind, we have to simply exclude chemicals from being area of conflict. In this concept, the existing challenge mechanism to meet the chemical threat should go beyond traditional concept of chemical warfare. Today, provisions of Chemical Weapons Convention, UN Council Resolution 1540, other arrangements, Australia Group and others, are not enough. The chemical weapons are not used for illegal purposes or are not misused. I believe that OPSW 3.0 and this global architecture concept introduces a vision for this global consensus that chemicals should not be misused for illegal purposes. In this global chemical architecture, there are 3 core processes. First, we have to move beyond traditional arms control and disarmament and move towards chemical weapons, towards preventing chemical weapons reemergence. I'm very proud because I invented this concept before Third Review Conference. I was still at the OPSW. But this concept, unfortunately, did not get real development for last years. Secondly, we have to introduce integrated system for chemical safety and security as part of international CBR or WMD international system, which should include environmental security and health security. Again, forget about going only on chemicals. It should be linked with environment and health is the only way to be comprehensive. And third important issue, which is forgotten carry of chemicals. You have to increase resilience and introduce cybersecurity in all chemical activities to prevent misuse of toxic chemicals via computer or industrial control systems. I was part of exercises where we released chlorine and ammonia through computer. It's today a reality. Our center, thank you, Brian, for introducing so well the center, undertook a series of initiatives with the international community between 2012 and 2018 that encouraged development of global chemical safety security architecture, free from political controversies, as a basis for global chemical architecture and basis for PCW 3.0. I'm very proud that we see each other today as a leader in global efforts to enhance safety security. Our underlying belief is that ensuring chemical safety and security and complying with environmental protection standards, they are essential conditions in the research, manufacturing, and trade of chemicals. It means the whole network of chemical activities, from development till their disposal. Not only, let's say, in the area of production, what usually happens in discussions. And it should link with internal and external security, public health protection, economic and trade cooperation, development and humanitarian policies. We offer an inclusive participatory program development. We avoid divisive political concepts and language that hinder progress in nuclear and biosafety and security. We introduced integrated program to increase resilience and cybersecurity in all chemical activities. You can see this concept in the papers I presented. We initiate a global network on the education, training, chemical safety and security. We also introduced process of global chemical safety and security summits, HEMS. The first summit was in 2016 in Kielce with 47 countries. Second was last year in Shanghai with 50 countries, over 2,000 participants. And we recently were participating in the Global Chemical Security Summit organized by Homeland Security and Canada and then some other partners at Interpol headquarters, when some of you, we met there. The global process is going. We believe that this process should be done through operationalizing the process of global chemical security, should be promoted through, not through new solutions, new regulations, but by operationalizing and internationalizing the existing national international best practices, trainings, and technical solutions. This, I believe, is also answer how we have to move on global chemical security, not by new things, but by those what has been already introduced. And here, I would like to tell you that United States is true leader in this. And something I have to pay tribute to especially David Wolf for that, because many of these programs are receiving growing international attention. We implement our modern approaches through projects in Africa, in the Middle East, through a Jordan program on chemical safety security, which we can also introduce later. And also, we coordinated the development and support implementation of the integrated program on chemical safety security in Ukraine, run by OEC and invented by Ambassador Verba. We also recently implemented a major program on civil protection against chemical threats in Eastern Europe. We received a major fund for this program from European Commission. This part of national and regional programs is another key element in developing global chemical safety architecture. We believe that these programs, especially in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, offer practical, inclusive, and effective chemical safety security in practical terms. We look especially towards this program for chemical safety security in the Middle East, financed by DETRA, the US government, as an important and very innovative tool to develop concept of regional chemical safety and security confidence building measures. We believe that through such a concept, we can bring countries of the Middle East to work together. This very innovative concept, we hope we can discuss this and engage you in this development. I encourage you, US community, international partners, United States, to join us in the process of moving towards a reducing chemical threat. I invite you to join ICS activities to enhance chemical safety security worldwide. And again, we came here to bring to you that together we have to change the existing approaches because they are not enough. And let me conclude by saying that without restoring consensus, we will never achieve global chemical disarmament. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christophe, and thanks to Kim and Trevor and to Brian. My name's Rick Cupid, for those of you who don't know me. And as we set up the first panel, and before I introduce the first panel, I've got a few housekeeping remarks. So if participants in the first panel would like to kind of get up on the stage, I'll get going here. We have, just to note, we have a live streaming audience. That means basically you need a microphone. So they won't hear you if you ask questions. We are going to have a question and answer period. We do have set aside time for that. Secondly, we're engaging, if those of you who've got have the agenda, you will note we're going to try to do kind of a word cloud exercise. So if you look on your phone, you can get, there's a little app that you can get. And if you look at the app and enter the code there, as we go through the day, there are questions, and you can answer the questions based on what you see, especially in the first panel. That's the idea. And then during the second panel, my team will spend time kind of putting together all of those answers and look at it and develop what we call a word cloud. And that reflects what you see in the audience as important takeaways from this. We're going to hopefully have a breakaway, time to have a coffee break. We're supposed to be by 3:30. I hope we can get near to that time, and then have our second panel, which will be hosted, moderated by Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. But our first panel, let me start by mentioning, introducing our moderator here, Mr. David Wolf. He's the director of the Infrastructure Security and Compliance Division at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's served as acting deputy assistant secretary for infrastructure and protection and is currently the director of the compliance division in the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS. He leads the national implementation of the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards Program. He's been, and I've had the great good fortune of working with Dave on several things, but in particular as co-chair, he's been co-chair of with Canada with the G7 Global Partnership Chemical Security Working Group, and really, as Trevor mentioned, it really got it back into the global partnership and got attention paid to this issue in the global partnership. He's got a Bachelor of Arts degree in Government History from Georgetown, and a law degree from Emory, both places where I've taught. So thank you. Let me briefly just give a quick, we have a little change. Just to let you know, we had Lieutenant Colonel Manaf Garibay from Jordan, who was going to speak about the Jordan project at the very last minute. As of, I think, yesterday, he was not able to attend. So in his stead, though his partner here is also Ambassador Pachere, who's going to talk a little bit about the project on chemical security and safety in Jordan. We've also, as you can see, have Ambassador Vytautas Verba, this former OSCE project coordinator in Kiev. Ambassador Verba is the chief advisor on foreign policy to the Speaker of the Lithuanian Parliament. He was OSCE project coordinator in Ukraine, head of mission. He was a team leader of the Odessa group of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. Prior to that, he was special envoy to EU's Eastern European Partnership at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Lithuania, and was a coordinator for the preparation of the third Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius. He's been ambassador of Lithuania to the Netherlands, and I think for our purposes, more importantly, as the perm rep to the Organization of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons from Lithuania. And he's got all sorts of awards, including, I appreciate you've got the Knight's Cross for Order of Merits to Lithuania. That stands out, but many others, so we're privileged to have him. We also are joined by Ms. Kelly Murray, who's the branch chief of compliance and infrastructure security compliance, and I had the good fortune to get a chance to hear Kelly speak at the Global Security Summit at Interpol in Lyon, and talk with her a bit about there. And I think in terms of knowing about what industry knows about standards and codes and all of that, she's the person. So I was really pleased. She's the acting branch chief for the compliance branch with infrastructure security compliance and the cybersecurity, again, an infrastructure security agency at DHS. She's a technical authority in the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards regulation and is responsible for providing advice and counsel to the division on issues related to CFATs. So she's responsible for overseeing the security site plans, which is incredibly important under the CFATs program, and the risk-based performance standards, dealing with inspectors and all sorts of issues related to engaging the community, the regulated community. So really pleased to have her here. And then finally, someone I've had really great pleasure to work with on OPCW, CWC issues, but also a variety of other issues at the State Department. We have Miss Mallory Stewart. Now she is fortunately for us, a non-resident fellow here at Stimson Center, but she's also a principal member of the technical staff and the Global Security Research and Analysis with Sandia National Laboratories. Her areas of expertise are chem, bio, but also space security, missile defense, and a range of non-proliferations and arms control law, because not the only reason why she's an expert in all those, but she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy in the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance within the T family at the U.S. Department of State. And she was responsible for overseeing the Office of Emerging Security Challenges and the Office of Chemical and Biological Weapons Affairs. So she's a recipient of the Secretary of State's Award for Excellence in International Security Affairs, and that's a pretty rare award at the State Department, I will note, and particularly for her work in the international efforts to eliminate Syrian chemical weapons. She was a litigation associate of the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell prior to joining the State Department, but we're really lucky to have her. So let me turn it over to Dave, and we'll hopefully we can wrap this up close to 3:30 and have time for question and answer before, maybe between 3:15, 3:30 now, and if we can get to that, and then we can have a nice coffee break. There will be cookies, I guess. So let me stop there. Thank you all.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you all for being here today. So many of my very favorite people in the global chemical security community arranged in one room here. So, great effort putting this program together. Really appreciate Stimson Center's work on this, and certainly the work of the International Center for Chemical Safety and Security. So, I am guilty as charged, Dave Wolf. I am responsible for leading the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security to foster security at America's highest risk chemical facilities, and it has also been my great privilege to have served for the past 3 years or so as co-chair of the G7 Global Partnerships Chemical Security Working Group. Much of that time working with my friend and colleague, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, who is here today as well. Excited to see you here, Bonnie. And I will say that, and as Trevor noted, one of the things on which we have been working pretty hard within the global partnership over the past years has really been to sort of operationalize a vision for global chemical security and to look toward tangible things we can do to build capacity around the globe, to build cultures of chemical security in places that are in need of building those cultures. And I will say that in furtherance of that effort, we have, as Trevor noted, put together and recently revised a strategic vision, but we have also built an action plan. So priority action items designed to foster the sharing of information, the promotion of exchanges of experts, the development of model legislation, model regulations, the sharing of information on voluntary frameworks for controls on chemicals, as well as regulatory frameworks. So all of those sorts of things on which we have been able to make a significant degree of progress. And efforts like this one, work of the sort that the Stimson Center, that the ICCSS do, that many of you all do on a day in, day out basis, gets us that much further down the road toward really raising the bar significantly with respect to chemical security. So thank you all for your efforts on all of those fronts. So I do not want to belabor opening remarks. There's a very aggressive timeline, revised timeline, I would note, outlined by Rick, but we have an esteemed panel of experts here. They have already been introduced, so I will just turn it to my left, Ambassador.
To me. Okay.
Christoph has deferred.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. First of all, thank you very much for your time that you come to see us here, and I'll try to be very brief to leave some time for the discussions and then for the questions. Among the nuclear, biological, and chemical threats to national and international security, the chemical threats are most common, de facto global, and most imminent, unfortunately. We came to Washington to highlight the chemical threat. We should move from looking at the threats of weapons of mass destruction, or CBRN, through a mushroom cloud, through nuclear threats. We came here to Washington as well to bring ex-argument for US audience on a need to concentrate on chemical threats. We need an active US support for moving chemical safety and security really global. The primary chemical threats today came from both actors, state actors and non-state actors, operating in the areas not controlled by any government. Today, a need to act against chemical threats is more urgent as ever and relevant than ever. Recent events in Syria, Iraq, UK, Malaysia, Australia demonstrate that chemical threat is all too real, and the consequences of an attack can be so devastating. The growth of chemical industry has increased access to toxic chemicals across the globe and consequently made safety and security in the production, transportation, and use of chemicals critically important for states, international organizations, and industries. Preventing, preparing for the responding to misuse of chemical agents requires a real concerted effort. This is an urgent call to global chemical safety for chemical safety and security. There is an urgency to introduce effective chemical security in the Middle East and support an enhancement of chemical safety and security in Ukraine, country where I was for the last 5 years. Effective chemical safety and security is an important barrier against chemical weapons for proliferation and terrorism, and core element in reducing chemical threats. A special role belongs to the international organizations, with an emphasis on United Nations, Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Interpol, and regional organizations, especially OSCE, the biggest regional organization in the world, which I represented recently. Today, international organizations, except some very few cases, do not offer real assistance to mitigate chemical security threats. They offer business as usual, what means discussions, deliberations, and declarations. They are deeply rooted in the past chemical security threats, which were threats of traditional chemical weapons. A good example of such approach is rooted in the past in the situation at the OPCW. Ambassador Paturey just mentioned a bit of it. OPCW, which recently concluded fourth review conference without a final document. Probably I was among the very last chairman of the conference of the state party to this Chemical Weapons Convention when we adopted the document, and that was, guess when, 2009. The review conference confirmed what is really, for the last years, there was lost global consensus on Chemical Weapons Convention implementation. While we need to support the mission of the OPCW to prohibit chemical weapons, there is a great need for the OPCW to accommodate to the changing world, where chemical threats are growing. The OPCW should develop itself towards a global leader to reduce chemical threats. OPCW should also develop towards a global platform to enhance chemical safety and security. I wish to give an example of such a positive role of the international organization in enhancing chemical safety and security. As I told you, more than 4.5 years, I was representing, almost 5 years actually, I was representing the OSCE Project Coordinator Office in Ukraine. We offered an innovative approach to assist Ukraine to mitigate chemical threats. This program, big program actually for projects, highlighted need to improve security of chemical weapons related materials and facilities, identify gaps in existing national practices and international standards to address chemical safety and security, and raise awareness of new tools that can be utilized to enhance chemical safety and security. Development and implementation of the Ukraine's integrated chemical safety and security is a good example of program which has both national and regional value. This is an important program of cooperation between the Ukrainian and international partners, with the OSCE as a leader. I should remind that OSCE is so far the biggest regional security organization in the world. We work closely with the International Center of Chemical Safety and Security, ICCSS, with Ambassador Krzysztof Patry personally, who functioned as international coordinator of the project, Ukraine's project development. Needless to say that being very nationally focused, you have to be very internationally oriented. The ICCSS has developed in Ukraine an international network to support the project development, what was badly needed. Recently, the center was invited by Ukraine partners, and I'm in my capacity, I also was invited, I was part of it, to support the protection of chemical critical infrastructure in Ukraine. Moving global in chemical safety and security is the best solution to meet global chemical threats. It's the best solution to reinvigorate the global process of weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation, and weapons of mass destruction disarmament. Going global on chemical safety and security will be a core component of reducing chemical threats nationally, regionally, and globally, and would reinvigorate and rejuvenate implementation of the Security Council Resolution 5040, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and other international treaties and arrangements in this area. Finally, I'd like to emphasize that we hope to receive a strong support from you, from a U.S. audience, from the government, industries, academia, and civil society for a few things. First, moving global on chemical safety and security. Secondly, development and regional implementation of Ukrainian and Jordanian programs. Thirdly, developing a concrete and active engagement of international organizations to mitigate chemical threats and support the OPCW development as a global agency to reduce chemical threats. And finally, fourth, supporting the multi-stakeholder participation, which builds a whole society approach in reducing chemical threats. Here, let me stop, Dave, and I'm more than happy to participate in further discussions and questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Really appreciate those important remarks. Why don't we pass the baton on to Ms. Kelly Murray.
I actually have slides because I don't want you all just staring at me, but I promise it's not going to be a death by PowerPoint. So I'm here primarily going to talk about the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, CFATS regulation. However, I'm really going to try and hit on our best practices and lessons learned as opposed to the whole process and all of the details. It's an extremely nuanced program, so I'm not going to bore you with those. Instead, I'm going to try and talk to those best practices and then some challenges that I think globally we can learn from. So these are just the topic areas that I'm going to kind of run down, but I promise it's not going to take that long. So one of our best practices that I think has really been successful in the CFATS program is that we regulate by chemical, not by sector. And in doing this, we're able to find anyone that uses, stores, ships, manufactures, any of these dangerous chemicals, as opposed to trying to focus in on one sector. But because we do that, we then look at a wide variety of types of facilities. So we use our Appendix A. It has 322 chemicals on it. And if any facility across the country has one of those chemicals at certain quantities, they then have to report to us. So far, we've identified over 30,000 facilities. And then we use our risk tiering methodology to find those highest of the high risks. So we look at the consequence that these chemicals could have happen, whether that be because it's a flammable chemical, a toxic chemical, someone could steal to create an explosive weapon, anything like that. And then we look at the threat and the vulnerability as well, so that we narrow in on those highest of the high-risk chemical facilities, which right now is about 3,400 in the United States. So we go from about 30,000 to 3,400 that we can really target in and look at from that risk-based approach. What does that mean, though? That means we regulate a wide variety of facilities. So from breweries and wineries that are my personal favorite, to semiconductor facilities, chemical manufacturers, refineries, raceways, a lot of different types of places using these chemicals. So we have to take what we call a very holistic approach to security. We do not tell any facility that they have to have a 7-foot fence with barbed wire. That would not be realistic for a university. Instead, we use risk-based performance standards. So we're very non-prescriptive, and we look at how a facility can detect an attack, delay an attack, respond to that attack. And then we also do look at the cybersecurity aspect that's been mentioned several times, and then the overall management principles on how you manage your security posture, your training, your background checks, your security organization. So we try and take that holistic look to make it realistic for any of these types of facilities to implement, but also to help us to make sure we are being consistent across the country. The other best practice that is real for our regulation, but also for just Homeland Security as a whole, is that public-private partnership. We have a lot of voluntary programs that any of those 30,000 facilities can avail themselves of. But even in a regulatory world, we really work very closely with our industry partners to make sure that they have buy-in to our program, that they understand why we're asking them to do certain security measures, and actually had them help us with our guidance materials and different programs like that. So it's one of those things that if you get their buy-in up front, it's going to be a lot easier to implement and enforce later. So speaking of enforcement, we do conduct our inspections, another best practice. It's great to put the information out there, but unless you are regularly holding those facilities accountable to it, how often are they actually going to be implementing all of these measures? So we do have inspectors all across the country that then go out and actually validate that these facilities are implementing the way that they want. So hitting on a couple of our challenges, while non-prescriptive is definitely one of our best practices, it makes it difficult to enforce. So coming up with standards that you can implement in a way that are understandable, realistic, but also enforceable, definitely a challenge for us. I'm trying to think. Self-reporting. Your ice cream manufacturer does not think they're a chemical facility. So going out and finding all of those facilities and making sure that they understand that they have to report to our program can be difficult. And lastly, regulations take a lot of time and a lot of work to manage, and trying to stay on top of the current threat picture can be very challenging. One of the ways that I think we have done this well is in the cyber realm, where our performance standard allows us to be broad enough that we can tailor our cybersecurity measures to the types of systems that facilities employ, so we can kind of always stay on top of that. But one of the areas that has recently come up that we're not as equipped to handle is the UAS, the unmanned aerial systems. How does a facility think about that when they're incorporating into their posture, and how can our regulation be broad enough to cover that? So those are just a couple of examples, and then I'll be happy to take questions at the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kelly. Next up, we have Mallory Stewart. Mallory?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a privilege to come back to the Stimson Center and speak with audiences that are generally very well informed, more so than me in many of these instances. On this particular topic, I'll keep it brief because I realize I'm standing between you all and question and answer, and then more importantly, cookies. So just to highlight some of the things that I wanted to mention in a panel on norms development, how well positioned the OPCW really is to address that, representing the community of 193 parties, 98% of the Earth's population, covered by the OPCW's extensive work and efforts. And so they have done a lot in this arena, as the panelists have already mentioned, and as many of you know, their chemical safety and security capacity building programs have really been instrumental. Since 2009, when they began, they've had, in their most recent impact assessment statement coming out in November, they've had more than 165 events and over almost 2,000 participants representing 150 countries, and they've really done an important work in sharing information regarding best practices and regarding the important standards development that needs to happen in the chemical security arena. I wanted to mention two specific products that I thought were really useful. 2 years ago, about this time, they came out with their report on best practices for states specifically. So it's the Needs and Best Practices Report on Chemical Safety and Security. It's a published document on the OPCW website, which went through the practices of 16 countries that voluntarily responded to their request for information about best practices. And the U.S. government's response was very lengthy, including many of the things that were just mentioned. This was an important document for several reasons, not only to show that countries were willing to share best practices and really to demonstrate that they are working to develop their capacities in the chemical security arena, but also this document went out of its way to catalog the existing legal and political architecture out there that maybe would not be automatically assumed to be involved in chemical security. So, for example, they listed treaties, non-binding arrangements, industry best practice documents that were guiding the community, and some of them were certainly familiar to the chemical security community, and many of them weren't. So they started with such things as 1540, UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which everyone realized was relevant to this discussion. But then they continued by listing the Basel Convention, which involved the movement of hazardous materials, Stockholm Convention, reducing the production and use of persistent organic pollutants, Rotterdam Convention, labeling and handling of hazardous chemicals, the Convention on the transboundary effects of industrial accidents, protecting people in the environment, highlighting how broad this issue really is across the legal realm. The Seveso Directive 1, 2, and 3, standardizing the requirements for facilities conducting specific higher risk activities with specific hazardous materials. Globalized harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, the GHS, voluntary framework for the classification of health and environmental impacts, the strategic approach to international chemical management, a framework focusing on chemical safety and life cycle management of chemicals, registration, evaluation, authorization, restriction of chemicals, European Union regulation designed to support health and environmental risks, responsible care, an industry-promoted set of codes focusing on worker safety, and then International Organization for Standards, the ISO standards that are across the board. Now, these are just a few. They actually went and listed more, and many of those are familiar to you, but some of them may not be. And that is part of the role of the OPCW and part of the role of us in this community to expand awareness of how broad chemical security issues really reach. Right? We've heard the panelists mention environmental, human safety, economic factors, industrial development. The list goes on with respect to non-pure chemical weapons-oriented effects, which many of us from the chemical weapons prevention community really think of when we think of chemical security. I think by broadening the legal architecture and the framework, we really get to a greater awareness of stakeholders, potentially stakeholders that will help fund, support, and spread awareness of this issue more broadly. So that happened 2 years ago from the OPCW, and last year they hosted an expert working group for non-state participants and stakeholders, non-state actor participants and stakeholders. And actually, several of my colleagues here in this room, including lovely Mayim and several from Sandia National Labs, participated in that. That was last December. And they came up with a set of recommendations to continue to educate, inform, and push out awareness of this issue. So I won't go into that, though I have extensive lists of their recommendations. But I just wanted to highlight those two efforts by the OPCW and their overarching sort of capacity building programs to signal that since 2009, at least, it has been very, very actively on their agenda and in their work, and it's continuing to grow, hopefully with the support of all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mallory. Very, very well said. And certainly a lot of work has been done in this arena. We do not always have to reinvent the wheel, but we need to share. Sharing is caring, as I like to say. So finally, though we are without our representative from Jordan, Ambassador Pachere has offered to say a couple of words about that program, and then we will throw it open.
Thank you, Dave. I was asked by my partners from Jordan Forces, to brief you on the very important program we are developing together, and we have a joint statement. Since we work together with the official government, the official partner, I always try to be very cautious in delivering messages. Therefore, I would make a few points, and of course, those who would like to see that statement, a joint statement, we would pass to it, also be available, I hope, at the website. But let me stress that we are developing together, Jordan Forces and International Center for Chemical Security, financed by the United States government through DETRA program, a program on enhancing chemical security for Jordan and the region, combined with the development of chemical security confidence building measures for the Middle East. The project has been developed and is conducted as a public-private initiative with the center, our center as the initiator and the international coordinator of the project, and Jordan Armed Forces as a leading partner and coordinator in Jordan. The project was initiated in the Warsaw Amman International Seminar conducted on 21st September in Warsaw, with several countries present, with all several organizations present. The program was very well received in the region. The core principle of the project development and implementation of the program is to concentrate on the national and regional prevention and preparedness against chemical threats. The leading approach is whole society approach, term invented by Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, which I love very much. Bonnie, this is your important input in the international security. This out of the statement, but it's very important. And let me also stress that this advantage of our project is introduction of a phased approach from national through transnational towards regional measures and cooperation. The project outcomes will be promoted in the countries of the Middle East and North America region. The basic economic presumption of the project is that chemical safety and security is not a cost but an investment. I'm very glad to have here Marius from Merrill Lynch. He's a finance officer and finance analyst. I hope to assist us in developing this zero cost the program. Therefore, the project implementation would open new opportunities for cooperation with partners from Jordan and the Middle East in economy, science and academia, with an emphasis on industry and trade cooperation in chemical activities. The project goes beyond traditional disarmament, non-proliferation and anti-terrorism measures. It offers an active approach to develop a set of confidence-building measures to be followed by all stakeholders, free from political biases, and to ensure that the toxic chemicals are used only for peaceful purposes. The project also is going to develop a concept for regional confidence-building measures to ensure that toxic chemicals are used only for peaceful purposes. This concept will be presented at the International Amman Warsaw Seminar in March 26, 28 March this year in Amman, where the project will be concluded. On behalf of Jordan Armed Forces and the International Center for Chemical Security, we thank Defense Threat Reduction Agency for financial support for this project. We invite U.S. international partners to join the development and implementation of this integrated and comprehensive project. We invite you to join Amman Warsaw International Seminar on 26-28 March 2019, where the project will be concluded. And we also invite you for the project development, all of you, governments, industry, organizations, academia, and civil society. This project is very inclusive, and I'm very proud to make this statement on behalf of the Jordan government, Jordan Armed Forces, and the center. And again, we are grateful for your U.S. support for this. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Krzysztof. Sounds like a very, very promising program. All right. We have questions. Yes, ma'am.
All right. Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Lovely Umayam. I'm an analyst here at the Stimson Center. The lion's share of my work is nuclear security, but as Mallory mentioned, sometimes I dabble in chemical security. So this question is actually for Kelly. Thank you so much. I'll stand up. Thank you so much for such a concise but detailed presentation of CFATs. A couple of the best practices resonated with me, particularly the risk-based approach as well as the non-prescriptive approach, especially when you're reaching out to industry directly. But can you speak a little bit more about the process of reaching out to the breweries and the ice cream shops that don't necessarily understand that they have sensitive chemical substances that they're taking care of, because presumably that that's another layer of awareness that you have to build up before you could convince them that they have to implementation these particular standards. So I was wondering if you could just comment on the relationship that DHS presumably will have to develop in order for those partners to understand their role in the larger chemical security architecture. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It is definitely a challenge, as I kind of said. The first step is just identifying those groups. And so we do a great deal of outreach through associations, through local planning communities, through our state partners. As I said, we have about 150 inspectors all across the country. So they are engaging regularly with their Homeland Security advisors, state chemists, state officials, just to find those folks. And then there is a great learning curve that we have to talk to them about the dangers of those chemicals. So we always start with very high-level information on just why this chemical is even listed on our list of chemicals. But then we will actually do theoretical modeling for them and get our risk experts and our chemistry experts on the phone showing them this is the damage that your facility could cause. And that is, I think, where it really resonates with a lot of them is I did not realize I play a part in my community and keeping it secure. So I think visually showing them some of those risk products and being able to discuss with them the consequence modeling that we do really has helped to bring them on board. And the vast majority of them, maybe it's because of that public-private partnership that we've established, really appreciate it and they very, very rarely push back once they understand the dangers of the chemicals they possess.
Alrighty. Do we have other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Deborah Decker with the Stimson Center. I had a question on the risk-based modeling, and one of the things, I guess, I'm sorry, it's on the CFATS program again, but when you come up with the vulnerability assessments, have you been able to, these are model-based, have you been able to do any analysis on maybe OSHA events or health and safety events or like the West Texas explosion or things like that to show that these actually do reduce risks?
So I'm going to tackle your question in kind of two parts. We have absolutely done modeling, working with OSHA partners, EPA partners, a lot of different partners to make sure that all of our consequence modeling, our vulnerability analysis, and our threat information is real and has been validated by several communities. As far as how we measure the success of our program or how we are buying down risk, that is one of those impossible questions, right? You can't measure the negative, what didn't happen because of CFATs. But what we have done is we have looked at our facility community security postures when they enter our program and then when they get approved in our program, and we've actually seen over a 50% increase in security measures. So that is kind of how we see that we can say we are buying down risk because we are increasing security.
Krishna.
Thank you. I like these questions about CFATs. You know, we studied CFATs very well, and it's something interesting. You cannot repeat this internationally. There is a fundamental problem here, you know, because U.S. is so far ahead of the world community in this area. Incredibly. We moved a little bit, we used CFATs, and we developed something different. We developed not CFATs as standards, but CFATs as best practices. At the summit in Shanghai in 2017, we developed this a concept and presented, and by the way, it was agreed at the summit to promote that. I have a problem with that because we try to move this really chemical, safety, security, best practices in that context, you know, because, you know, US is so well ahead introducing the concept of cooperation as a public-private partnership. This is what I love most in the US approach. You succeeded in bringing private industry as your partner, not as your client. It's de facto impossible in Europe yet, and not say about other countries. Therefore, again, I believe that we have to move towards best practice first, and through that to show, engage industry in moving towards introducing control of toxic chemicals through this. I hope to discuss this also with Dave in coming days because we are staying here till Wednesday, and also to engage industry. But thank you very much for this question because de facto, we have to move towards CFATs internationally through phased approach. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Sure.
I really appreciate that because this program we started on nuclear security started with standards. We first years ago started.
Yeah.
Then we were talking to Nuclear Energy Agency and we said, first of all, worldwide, as you point out, regulators may not be proficient, you may not be as advanced. So we moved towards culture because you can have a standard and check the box, but then culture is needed, and then who defines culture but management? So one of the things I was curious about, and I don't know the full CFATS vulnerability assessments, I've just briefly reviewed it, is that senior managers in there are only mentioned once in the cyber incident reporting. They're not generally part of that vulnerability model that you look at. But we found that to be so important, and so we've developed a good governance template working with industry in the nuclear area, and are prototyping it now with, you know, actually in the field with them. And I was kind of thinking about its application cross-industry for senior managers to be able to define this and thereby reduce their tort liability where there is that in most countries. So I'm just curious about the senior management aspect of it.
So just to clarify, we require our facilities to do vulnerability assessments, and then based on our risk assessment and their vulnerability assessment, we then ask them to develop the security plans, which are the performance standards. And one of those is Risk-Based Performance Standard 17, Officials and Organization. And it is bottom up, top down, all of the different individuals in your company, senior managers, corporate officials, all the way down to your operators at the end of, are they getting training? Have you built that security culture? Do you have that organization established and that buy-in from all levels? One of our best practices that this was too concise for was involving your employees at every level. You know, they are your first line of defense, and they can be your biggest vulnerability at the same point. So making sure that they are involved through training, drills, exercises, and just understand, again, the dangers of these chemicals and why we'd want to protect them.
Thank you for a great presentation. Bonnie Jenkins. We heard a little bit about some of the challenges of the smaller industries, like mom and pop shop or the ice cream. But could you also say a little bit more about the challenge between big and small industry, and maybe also internationally, the challenges of working with big versus small industry? Because my understanding is still it's a smaller industry, even internationally that's more of a challenge in terms of safety and security. Understandable cost issues, but maybe say a bit about that both domestically and internationally.
I'll start just from the CFAT's U.S. perspective, and I hope ice cream makes the word count thing, right? Like that's my new goal, is to get that one in there. Let's say it a couple more times. It's interesting because both can be difficult, working with small mom and pop type facilities where you're having to train them on security culture and help them identify those solutions, and then working from big corporate America where they already have their standards and they know better than you know, and they're not going to let you kind of come in. But I think what it comes down to, again, is that partnership, that model that we've created. We actually will work with corporate security officers to help them standardize their security plans across the entire country, so that each facility is not having to kind of debate with us when we get on site, but we can set that kind of corporate standard. So I think the difference is, kind of how you mold the program. With the small businesses, it is our inspectors working, staying longer hours, and helping them to identify their security plan. With the bigger ones, it's working with them to identify across their corporation how they can do this. But I also do think that a lot of the bigger corporations have actually said, oh, I wish I was a higher tier, because then I can sell security and my boss will let me put in more security measures. So also working with them on that front to give them the justification that they need to go to their boss and ask them for that funding.
Yeah, quickly on that. Bonnie, you covered a fundamental issue, because in chemical area, we have some fundamental problem. What we need is to cover small and medium companies. And we are covering de facto big companies. Big companies are well protected, They have, if you go through Dow Chemicals, which I'm partner, I'm very proud to be part of Dow Chemicals, promoting Dow Chemical solutions worldwide in that, they are safe. The fundamental issue is exactly small and medium, and not only production, but mainly storage and transportation, which is not covered. And what I like, again, I'm look here like an ambassador of US in these areas, but de facto it is, I'm here ambassador of DHS solutions in that, because they really are not only practical, but they found solutions how to address these two fundamental requirements. Go to small and medium, and cover, move from production towards storage, transportation, and use of toxic chemicals. And here, that's what really, maybe remember my statement, we use two magic words: operationalizing and internationalizing these existing practices, because they exist. We have to make them international. And then, Bonnie, we achieved what you want, to go international on that.
And I would just add to that, that both domestically and internationally, the larger companies have an interest in raising the bar across the entire community and working with the smaller companies. First, certainly, they feel as though if they are going to be investing this money in security, everyone should have to invest the money in security. But really, when something happens, when there is an incident, when there's a vulnerability at a smaller mom and pop operation, it creates a black eye for the entire community, and the entire corporate community has a concern about regulations that are perhaps more onerous than they might otherwise be, coming at them as a result of an incident that occurs at any facility, to include smaller facilities. So they certainly have an interest in contributing to that broader culture of chemical security, and we, from the government perspective, want to leverage that impulse. Sir, I'm sorry.
Stefano Costanzi, American University. I also have a question about CFATs. First of all, thank you for a very engaging and informative presentation. You mentioned that in Appendix A there are about 332, I think you mentioned, chemicals listed. How comprehensive do you think that is that list? clearly the chemical space is vast. 330 chemicals are not very many. Do you think that there is a need to expand that list?
So we are always looking for whether or not we've captured the right chemicals. We initially created Appendix A, and we have not had a chance to update it. As one of my bullets said, the regulatory process is long, and that would require regulation change. But we have absolutely seen the need to add chemicals and to remove chemicals, as well as just changing quantities. Some of them we found don't produce the consequence with our modeling. So it is something we're interested in doing, but it is a long road to get there.
Thank you all for excellent presentations. I'm Seema Gehlot, Senior Fellow at Trade Technology and Security Program at the Stimson Center. I want to ask another question. I have lots of questions for Kelly, but we'll leave that alone. I have had a lot of interaction with governments in the developing world and industry, chemical industry in particular. And my experience is that unless there is a regulation to start with, none of the best practices or any of these institutions actually take root within the industry. It seems like, in most cases, in the absence of regulation, it's like traffic lights in most of the developing world. It's a suggestion. So it's not a rule. So what is it that you think OPCW or other organizations, whether they are non-government organizations like us or others, can do to move state parties to having some kind of regulations on chemical safety and security to begin with?
Yeah, maybe I'll start because the Ukraine, the country I was posted for the last 4.5 years. Well, unfortunately, the country was either had completely absent regulations, or the regulations were so outdated that that you cannot even tell people. But from my personal perspective and from personal point of view, the real sort of push or leverage is not just to convince the government. Of course, to convince the government is just one thing. One of our projects in Integrated Chemical Safety and Security Program is to make updated regulatory basis for everything. And this is a Goliathan job actually to do, and maybe, I don't know, it will be not ended in 3, 5, 10 years. I mean, this will be a real challenge. But another one incentive to do something is imminent threat. Needless to say, what's going on right now in the Ukraine, eastern part of the country. So when threat is real, and what I noticed, I was a regular visitor to the these conflict areas. So the communities, cities, municipalities, bigger, smaller, even schools, they push you to do something because they know, if, let's say, you don't need a ice cream shop, but if water distillation facility is being hit, or then everybody is around in trouble, regardless, contact lines, I'm not talking here about the conflict, I'm talking here about the people. But why, another one thing I wanted to mention here, why, this Organization for Security and Cooperation was good in that case, because for us, there are 3 so-called famous pillars, and human security is the same like military security issue. For us, that was human security, and therefore, our grassroots approach was the only way to reach out and to do something. And also, we've been really reciprocated by the civil society, first of all, by the cities, by the people. And that was an even bigger pressure than from the government in Kiev. Big industries, big governments, in the capitals, maybe one day they will look at this. But these were people, and real communities to press you to do something. And just to end it up, my office is still called Project Coordinator's Office. You saw it and knows pretty well that we made projects, and projects mean for us to bring a result. If I will not bring a result, nobody would believe you and nobody would participate from the recipient side, and nobody would put bet money on you just to do this project, so that you really concentrate on the process and you really have to work with the real things, not imaginary, not some kind of things, and something what is real, what you can produce result. What can produce result? Obviously, I very much agree with Krzysztof, who says that the United States, probably you are very far ahead with so many things. But these best practices, if it will be real pressure, will be very easily and instantly brought into the situations where they're mostly needed. So that's why this is my point. So I definitely will take away this, and we're gonna just offer to the people I worked with and I'm still working with.
Excellent. Mallory, would you like to add to that?
Sure. Just a point to follow up that even the Chemical Weapons Convention still has countries that don't have any implementing legislation, and so all of the treaties that I mentioned and political documents have an impetus, have a push to actually implement, and that's not necessarily effective, right? Because countries are dealing with other issues. There's less. There's more pressing matters, and that's why I think the movement toward the non-state community, the academia, industry, sort of the development of best practices is useful to try to get at that. But really your question goes to what pushes these smaller players to do the right thing. And I think so much of that is context dependent, right? It could be security, right? It could be that, if your facility is not secure, you threaten the environment, the human health in the surrounding areas. It could be that if you have a community that has a well-developed legal system, you have potential liability, right? As we've heard in the nuclear arena and in other emerging security arenas, there's an effort now to use the insurance industry to potentially pressure best practices in a community that otherwise does not have sufficient regulation to force it to do the right thing. That may work. It could be that there is an educational campaign, as I know the OPCW is working on, with respect to these smaller entities, that demonstrates that if you have good chemical security provisions and practices, you actually protect yourself economically from both losing chemicals, potentially just to theft or other sort of attrition, but also from events that would then bring down both your small facility and the community more broadly. So it's really trying to target those smaller communities and figure out what impels them in some way, that what compels them to do the right thing, either if in the absence of regulation, which in 9/10 of the situation we face, there is no sufficient regulation that can get them to understand how important it could be and how helpful it could be across the board. So I think that's one of the awareness raising efforts that all of these communities are engaging in.
But isn't it also, it's also money.
Right, economics is a driving factor.
Yeah, so the
And insurance.
may not have the money for bigger industries. So if there could be any kind of sharing of, and I think you mentioned that large industries helping small industries put the money that they need to put in to build this.
So important points. We have the cookies have arrived. Okay, we have blown through Rick's compressed, revised timeline, but I think we've had some excellent discussion here. Amazing audience participation. So thank you to all of you who posited questions, and certainly some time to continue the discussion over some cookies and soda.
Thank you, our moderator.
Thank you. And thank you to our esteemed panel. Thank you for stuff. Of course. No, you're good.
no, together, okay? Together we stay here, okay? This, doing in front of Simpson, because they don't know how to say, okay? Okay, Dave, let's say this. Join us, okay?
I think, yes, online. Well, it's live stream.
Okay, wait a moment.
One, two, three, ice cream.
Ice cream.
Oh, sorry.
As someone who actually worked in creamery making,
Okay.
and has been hit by it.
But can you control about with the legs? Everything okay?
Everything all right.
Yes, everything. Exactly.
One, two, three, ice cream. One, two, three, ice cream.
Awesome.
Grab a mic here. And
So we are.
yeah, now, go sit here. Why don't you just take this? There's going to be 3 or 4 of us. So we'll have Mary, myself and Mary.
How do you pronounce Mary Beth's name?
Yes, actually, it's
Pacelli. Thank you again for doing it. Here's your mic if you want to get.
And Costanza. Stefano Costanza.
Yeah, if you want to get
It's
mic'd up.
very
Push that wherever you wish. And this lets you do it.
Is it on?
Not right
Hello.
now.
Okay.
No, it is, but you can mute it.
How do I turn it on? Is it on? Okay. Push. Okay. Testing. Okay.
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
And please help yourself to some coffee.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Okay.
Green is on.
While we're taking a break, we're going to show a little video if you're interested. Many of you have seen this before. This is a video produced by Interpol about chemical security. It won a Golden Dolphin at the Cannes Film Festival, actually. Let's go ahead. if we can get a few, I know there are a few people still out there, but I'd like to go ahead and get started. So thanks. Let me introduce Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. I've had the privilege to know Ambassador Jenkins for a number of years, and she's been perhaps the strongest supporter, certainly, of UNSCR 1540, but a range of capacity building approaches and partnership approaches to issues of nonproliferation, especially for WMD nonproliferation, and has, I think, the widest travel schedule of anybody I've ever known while she was in government for many years, but I said, not to just try to do this off of the top of my head, she was our ambassador for threat reduction and the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation at the State Department, but she's also been with, if I recall, a program officer at Ford Foundation, and has been also been worked NSC and has done a whole variety of tasks in and out of government, a really great example of a wonderful public servant, and now has taken on several new roles, working with Brookings and the University of Pennsylvania, and also has established her own new organization trying to encourage and build having more women of color involved in these kinds of processes in our discussions. So let me turn it over to Bonnie, who's kindly enough to agree to moderate the panel.
Thank you, Rick. It's great to be here. Great to see old friends and to get back into these issues of chemical safety and security that we worked on so closely for so many years when I was in government. I was asked to moderate the second panel on new tools and industry engagement to enhance chemical safety and security. But before we start, I was also asked if folks could turn to this page of their agenda and go to www.menti.com, enter the code that you see and vote so that we can have some responses from the word cloud activity that we're doing and that Rick mentioned earlier today. So make sure that you do that if you can. So I have the distinguished honor to introduce our panelists. And so I think you know Rick, but I will say a bit about him anyway, okay? Dr. Richard Cupid is Senior Fellow and Director of the Partnership and Proliferation Prevention Program at the Stimson Center. He heads Stimson's Chemical Threat Reduction Project and his 1540 Assistance Support Initiative, among other activities. And prior to joining Stimson, he served as U.S. Special Coordinator for UN Security Council Resolution 1540, where we work together quite often in the government. He did this from 2012 to 2016 and as an expert for the UN Security Council Resolution 1540's committee from 2005 to 2012. Next, I want to introduce Ms. Mary Vecellio, who is Research Associate Partnership and Proliferation Prevention Program at Stimson Center. She works with the Partnership Proliferation, as I mentioned, and her research focuses on WMD nonproliferation with specific focus on radiological source security, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540 assistance activities, and chemical weapons-related material security. She is particularly interested in issues related to preventing the spread of chemical weapons and related materials, and has a master's in nonproliferation and international security from the Department of War Studies at King's College. Next, we have Cindy Vestergaard, a good friend of mine, who's the Director, National Safeguards Program at the Henry Stimson Center. Her current research focuses on the impact of evolving international safeguards obligations on states and facility operators. Her projects include looking ahead to nuclear facilities of the future, such as deep geological repositories and multinational fuel cycle facilities, and how these emerging facilities, coupled with emerging technologies, challenge and or enhance the management of safeguards. Her portfolio also includes chemical weapons disarmament, biosecurity, and import-export controls. And finally, but not least, we have Dr. Stefano Costanzi, Associate Professor of Chemistry at American University. Dr. Costanzi is an Associate Professor of Chemistry at American University in Washington, D.C. He holds a laureate degree in chemistry and a PhD in medical chemistry from the University of Camerino, Italy, as well as a Master of International Service from American University. Prior to joining American University in 2012, he worked for 10 years at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. Costanzi's teaching interests mainly focus on the countering of chemical weapons, with courses for sciences majors covering toxicology and pharmacology countermeasures, as well as courses for non-science majors covering history, norms, and international security. And I want to apologize, I forgot to mention that Cindy is also a doctor, as is Rick Cupid. So we have several doctors up here. Okay, so I think the way we're doing this is Rick and Mary, if I don't mind me calling everyone by their first name, we'll have, I think, 10 minutes amongst the two of you. And then our final two panelists will have 10 minutes each. And I have my phone, not because I'm making phone calls, but because I am checking the time. So Rick, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure. I'm glad some of you have managed to stay, and I know it's a long day to do this. I think we build a little bit in our presentation on some things that have already been said. One of the first things to note in the review of UN Security Council Resolution 1540, the second comprehensive review, and I would say in the review of the activities of the Chemical Weapons Convention, what we've really noted in recent years is there's still pretty low levels of implementation. So that's after 20 years for the Chemical Weapons Convention, and 1540 is moving up on its 15th anniversary next year. So, and this is particularly true in the chemical area. Let me move on to my own slides here. So we designed a project with the support of the Government of Canada to sort of take two elements here. One is, and in particular, as it's was discussed a little bit earlier, was facilitating a dialogue about developing or emerging standards and best practices, how they relate, what's out there. Mary's going to speak to that part of the project and where we are. We've just started implementing the project, so it's pretty new. And the other part is developing a compendium of laws and regulations, kind of mapping where everyone is globally. And I'll speak to that. Some of you have seen a couple of these slides before, or variants of them, in Lyon at the Chemical Congress. So we are going to do a little more, but that's I just listed in the slide there. Let me just go to, oops, went too far. Trying to do two here. When we looked at what states had in place, the place we started was the 1540 committee matrices. These come from 2015, so like a lot of things, they're a snapshot, and they're now getting a little dated. But we went through all the matrices, 193 nation states, and tried to look at all the measures, laws, and regulations that were in place for all various obligations of and some of the recommendations for 1540. And there's a little over 15 of them that you could have done something on or had something on. And if you look there, the information suggests that there's a large number of states that have essentially done nothing, or at least we can't identify anything. That's that on the left side of the graph there. There's that pretty much usually is we've adhered to the CWC. So you're part and party of that. Then you see a big gap, and then you see states, if they have done something, tend to have done a couple of things. They seem to have done sort of more measures. So that's a pretty bimodal kind of distribution. but that's what we've seen out there. We're going to build on that and develop a compendium of all the laws and measures. But that was an index. In other words, if you had done well, most states had something, at least something in place in terms of laws and regulations, then you were going to get a higher score than if you had nothing in place. We looked at, just to give you an example of what this might mean or way we might use it, is just look at the states. There's about a little over 120 that have actually made declarations to the OPCW. So that's a third of them, more or less, haven't made any declarations to OPCW. But those that have had, looking on there, I went through and we tried to look at high, medium, low in terms of the index. That is, did they do very little, are they high, or did they do a lot, rather they were high, medium, or low? And what you can see is one good thing here is it does look like, at least the states declaring, states with a lot of detectable and declarable and inspectable facilities did indeed have a fair number of measures in place. We can't say whether those measures were any good, but they had them in place. That's the second part of this thing. But if you look down there, there's still a lot of states in that low category that do almost nothing. And I would suggest some of those are in pretty dangerous places. Some of them are also in the midst of falling apart. One could argue Venezuela is clearly listed there, but we also, we've talked a little bit, I know ICCSS has done work in Kenya and done some other things. And again, this is a snapshot. Things may have changed since 2015 when this data was collected, but we're going to build off of this and create a compendium. Two other things I wanted to note is through our assistance support initiative, we've also been able to try to identify how many CBRN non-proliferation assistance programs and projects there are out there worldwide. And if you'll see, less than 10% of them are specifically about chemicals and chemical weapons. I think that goes to the point that was made earlier, that the immediate risk in many places right now is not a mushroom cloud as much as a cloud of gas somewhere. So I think that speaks to that. As in terms of engaging industry, one of the nice things that 1540 committee did was actually look at that from the beginning. There's a recommendation that states work with and inform industry and the public. So it doesn't just say inform industry and the public, it says work with. But the unfortunate part there is that any form of outreach of the nearly 193 UN member states, we could only find outreach programs in 55 of them, and only 24 of them are specifically on chemical weapons. And I would say almost all of those were on working with industry to work on the declarations and the requirements for implementing the Chemical Weapons Convention. So again, I think pretty limited in terms of the numbers and where those states are. Let me turn it over to Mary, because she's going to focus on, well, if we start collecting, and we're going to continue to collect measures on laws and regulations and try to find those and build on that database. But the second thing is, well, are those laws and measures any good? And part of the way of figuring that out is, well, what's the best practices and standards, and are they encapsulated in those laws and regs? So,
thank you, Rick.
Mary.
So, as Rick has mentioned, what we've been doing at the Stimson Center is we've been researching the lack of measures in place to secure chemical weapons-related materials and facilities, as well as the lack of measures in place to implement these international obligations, such as those under CWC and Resolution 1540. So what we've done at the Stimson Center thus far is we've reviewed 29 sources related to chemical safety and chemical security. And now these 29 sources, they vary greatly with the intended purpose of creating a comprehensive collection of emerging standards and best practices. And what we mean by a great variance is we looked at international guidelines and recommendations, such as the Hague Ethical Guidelines and the United Nations recommendations on the transport of dangerous goods.
We've also looked at regional and country-specific regulations and policy plans, such as the United States CFATS and the European Union CBRN Action Plan. We've also looked at chemical industry initiatives, such as the US and European versions of the Responsible Care Security Code. And then we've also looked at the Code of Conduct for the practice of chemistry in the Middle East and Northern Africa, in which chemists from these regions have come together and written a code of conduct and are now working to have their governments and laboratory managers implement this code of conduct formally. And then lastly, we've also looked at sources that discuss general management practices in chemical laboratory facilities. And usually in these sources, they very clearly outline how to implement a chemical security program in a laboratory setting and how to implement a chemical safety program in a laboratory setting. And so based upon these sources, the Stimson Center has identified 14 potential emerging standards and best practices related to chemical safety and security. So some of these that we've identified include training, maintaining an inventory of sensitive chemical materials, maintaining an inventory of related equipment, conducting regular inspections, implementing cybersecurity practices, practicing green chemistry, and conducting background checks. And so ultimately, the information that we've researched, we will be using it to develop, as Rick has mentioned, an online searchable database of laws and regulations related to related to securing chemical materials in facilities. And we hope to use this database to then evaluate these laws and measures against the international standards that we've identified and that have also been discussed here today. And the hope for this tool is that stakeholders will be able to find practical and real examples of laws and regulations that they can review and refer to, so that they can then use them to take actionable steps to enhance their own chemical security and safety practices. So essentially, the Stimson Center is trying to add a new tool to enhance the global chemical safety and security infrastructure globally.
Thank you. 10 minutes exactly.
Okay,
Hey.
great. We didn't even practice.
No pressure to
And actually, I won't take 10 minutes. I'm sure I'm going to be a lot quicker. So I'm actually looking at the new technology side, and I hate the term, to be honest, emerging technology, because blockchain has already emerged, and in fact, it's more kind of evolving technology. I'm not going to go into the details of blockchain, but essentially to kind of go with looking at this global chemical architecture that you're talking about. For me, in terms of the reporting, the chain of custody of where materials are being traded is one of the issues that is where new technologies have an ability to come in. So particularly when we're looking at global supply chains and reporting even to the OPCW, issues of provenance are certainly of big concern in terms of, is the information trustworthy and is it traceable? And this is where DLT, distributed ledger technology, comes in. And just to be clear, blockchain is a subset of a DLT. If you want to know more about blockchain, please pick up the swag that's at the back of the room. But I won't get into the details here, other than to say that it is a mutable system where you can append each new data or transaction onto that, so you got blocks within a shared ledger system. So a number of participants, every time it's updated, every participant gets that information. If there's any attempt to modify that information, everybody in that system is alerted. There has been a demo test within the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. I think that's very interesting on the safeguard side, where it actually demonstrates that if a regulator and an operator are to collude, that the whole system would be aware of that. So there are ways to use technology to detect diversion, and certainly then to also diminish or at least reduce the potential of other proliferation pathways. On the chemical side, one of the things, so I've been looking at it from the safeguards perspective and the nuclear materials and trade and control there, and how states are doing the accountancy systems, and of course the International Atomic Energy Agency as well. And I think there are interesting similarities with the OPCW in terms of their incoming reports that could be of interest for a DLT platform. One of which is, in the IAEA sense, we have transit matching. So all nuclear materials need to be transit matched. I've shipped you 10 tons of uranium. in 1 month, you might register it in 3 months from now. You might even separate it out into different batches. And the IAEA has a hard time with its machine matching technology to be able to do that for international transfers. Domestic transfers are about 95% done, but international transfers are a lot more difficult, meaning that the ones that are decoupled or can't be transit matched have to be done manually. So that's not fun. The OPCW has a similar issue when it comes to transfer discrepancies, and that's on Schedule 2 and Schedule 3s. So on Schedule 1s, there's a pretty clear, very small, limited number, more than a couple of handfuls, but a smaller number of companies or certainly countries that engage in any small quantities for defense purposes. But Schedule 2 and Schedule 3 chemicals obviously is a lot wider distribution of the supply chain, and also, of course, much more uses for those chemicals. And that's where I think there's an area for distributed ledger technology to come in, certainly at the company level, and maybe this is something we can talk about later, Christoph, but what do we bring in a big company first? We are looking to do a proof of concept. So first, a mapping and scoping of the ecosystem, the flows of information, who are the actors involved, what are the user requirements of everybody, and of course, what is the regulatory environment in the country that the company works in. We're not talking about going straight to the international level right off the bat, just starting off with a few tests, proof of concepts at the, certainly at the company level, and maybe even eventually at the national level. On the safeguard side, we're pushing forward with looking at state systems of accounting and control. Chemical, we're a little bit further behind, but I think there's a lot to learn from safeguards into the chemical side as well.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you to the Stimson Center and the organizers for inviting me. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. Thank you. So, in my remarks, I want to talk about a problem that, together with the dual use of chemicals, affects substantially the ability to craft effective export control lists, but not only export control lists, in general, lists of chemicals of concern, including the CFATs, for example, that we just heard about. I'm referring to the fact that chemicals that have a similar structure, chemicals that look similar to one another, more often than not, will interact very similarly with living organisms. And so, for instance, if you have a drug that is an anti-cancer drug, another chemical that looks similar to it will probably, more likely than not, have anti-cancer properties, perhaps with a different degree of potency, but nonetheless will have similar properties. And so, as you see over here, by the same token, if you have a compound, a chemical that is a potent nerve agent like VX, another chemical that looks like it, like VR or Russian VX, will also be a potent toxic nerve agent. And it's exactly for these reasons that pharmaceutical companies, when they cover a drug candidate with a patent, they don't just cover just that particular one chemical, but they cover a whole family, a large family of chemicals that look like that particular one drug candidate. Because covering only one chemical would be actually a recipe for financial disaster. It would be revealing information to your competitors who then could develop and market similar drugs. So, for instance, over here, we are looking at a pharmaceutical patent for compounds, chemicals that could treat potentially heroin addiction. And the chemical on the right over there is the most potent chemical identified in the patent. And but the patent covers a very, very, very large family of compounds with structures similar to that one drug candidate, as you can see on the right over here, with a central scaffold similar to the one of identical to the one of the candidate, but 5 groups with variable chemical substituents all around. The Chemical Weapons Convention in its schedules takes a similar approach. While some of the entries in the Chemical Weapons Convention schedules list only specific individual chemicals, other entries identify family of chemicals. So here, for instance, in the slide, you're looking at Schedule 2B10, And this is a family of chloroethylamines that could be used as precursors for the synthesis of nerve agents of the V series. So the structure that you see on the left, that's scheduled 2B10, and on the right you see all the chemicals that fit within that particular definition. So it's more than one compound. Unfortunately, export control lists don't take that approach. They only list individual chemicals, enumerating them one by one. And clearly, there are very practical reasons behind this. It's much easier for operators that are not trained chemists to look at lists and verify whether or not a compound, a chemical under scrutiny is part of the list, rather than gauging whether or not that chemical is part of is a member of a family of chemicals. However, nonetheless, this opens up, as I will show you in a second, some loopholes for chemical proliferators. So for instance, the Australia group, that as you know well, is an informal forum of countries that seeks to harmonize export controls for biological and chemical weapons precursors, lists only one of the chemicals that would fit within the definition of Schedule 2B10. And specifically, it lists the precursor for the synthesis of VX, while the others are not listed at all by the Australia group. And however, when Syria acceded the Chemical Weapons Convention in 2013, Syria declared the possession of two chloroethylamines. And one of them is the precursor for the synthesis of VX, but there is also another one. And Syria declared the possession of 25 metric tons of that. And another one, that is the one highlighted in yellow, that is not listed in the Australia group. So, as I mentioned, there are practical reasons why export control lists are crafted the way they're crafted. Another list as well, we heard about the CFATs before. But I think that to close these loopholes, to close these dangerous loopholes for chemical proliferation, it would be very important to move export control lists towards a family-based approach. And in order to overcome these hurdles that I mentioned, what I propose is the development of a cheminformatics tool, of a tool composed of a software, a portable software that could be deployed in mobile phones or computers and whatnot, associated with a database of families of chemicals of concern, using a technology similar to the one that is used to track chemical patents. And it would be key for this tool to have an interface that is very easy to use, that can be operated by export control officials, customs officers, individuals that are not trained chemists. And for instance, a tool that would give the ability to scan figures of chemicals in order to enter a chemical of concerns, or to enter a chemical name, to enter a registry number, and whatnot. I'll stop right here. I hope I'm not being too technical with my remarks, but I'll be happy to provide clarification in our discussion.
Great, thank you. I want to thank all the panelists for being very informative as well as sincere. So, I would like to open it up now. We have a few minutes. I think we have to end by 4:50. Is that correct? So we have a few minutes for questions. So I want to throw it out to the audience for questions, and for the party itself.
Thank you all. My name is Robin Brooks with the Chlorine Institute, and my question is for Cindy. And so many of our members are, most of them are within the U.S., but we do have international members, and we do have companies that take chlorine from rail cars and repackage it into ton containers and cylinders. And over the years, there's been different tracking techniques, some barcodes and other things like that. We haven't settled yet on an industry standard, but that's always a thing that comes up. So you mentioned the proof of concept. So I was wondering, what you're looking for, and also what quantities you might track using something like blockchain, because the cylinders are 150 pounds, ton containers can hold a ton. So just more information on how it might be used practically.
All right, let's sneeze Yeah, on the chemical side, we're a lot further behind than we are on the safeguards front. So we've been working on this project on safeguards for about a year now. And so on the safeguard side, I can say that when we're just looking at initially, you know, how much hype is this, right? And is this really going to work? And so we seem to have identified that it certainly is worth testing. And so on the nuclear side, we have, of course, fungibility. I think where there's a lot of issues that could be on the chemical side. We have containers that are, some are washed out, used again. We have large volumes of material, but also in terms of the global context, it's quite small. In the chemical side, it would be much more expansive. But again, I mean, if we're looking at the IAEA, they started in 1980s, they had about 16,000 incoming reports. Now they're at 1 million. So we're talking about big data, how to secure it as well. The OPCW has mentioned since the early 2018, and there's a lot more cyber attacks or activity that's going after it. So is this also a means for securing material more, or at least certainly if someone's in the system, you know better what they're doing, which can be just as important to know what's happening inside the castle walls than protecting. So for us, in terms, first thing we would have to do is to map the ecosystem. What are the quantities? What are the issues for a company in terms of transferring to another company? What are the multi-jurisdictional issues? If you're looking at TradeLens, IBM and Maersk are coming together to put together a joint venture that is to eliminate the, just 200 pieces of paper just for a shipment of flowers. So that in and of itself, if we can eliminate a lot of we want redundancies, but if we can eliminate the people paper pushing side of things and at least streamlining that, then that also frees us up to be able to do better regulations in different ways. Even what you're talking about now, I'd love to add a feasibility to see if DLT could be done with that, for example. And there's also getting to the point now where, and this is where the technology is evolving quite rapidly, where everything is getting down to the smartphone level. So you should be able to scan with your phone. And that can be done even for widgets as much as it should be able to. I don't know how it would work on chemicals or liquids, but there must be a way.
David Centofanti from the FBI. This is kind of a general question, since you're all dealing with kind of innovative ways at solving problems. So when you're on the kind of the ground level of a new technology, it's really challenging to convince people to see the vision that you have. And I guess my question is, what advice do you have about people pursuing kind of innovative technology? And as you're doing it on the ground level, about convincing those that are kind of in management? And then also, do you feel a little bit of pressure to succeed in a way that's maybe different than typical? Because if you don't succeed, the next request might be a little bit more challenging.
Anyone want to take that on?
Sure, I could take a first crack. One of the things that I found really interesting about distributed ledger technology is that it's a technology for good. So when I have, usually in the nuclear field, none of it's a good news, right? I mean, everything has a dual use side of things. And so when I'm in the room and we're talking about DLT, and I'm learning about DLT as well, it's a very different conversation. And that in of itself, I'm still not quite sure I can identify exactly the different areas. And that'll be probably a research project that'll continue. But that part of it changes the dialogue in a way that is incredibly new for me. We're not talking about the potential of an autonomous robot or AI to press a red button. Here we are talking about actually how can we help each other streamline and make more secure materials, while at the same time sharing it. Sharing is caring, whereas... So what I've learned, though, is that it's just a lot of face-to-face meetings. It is... and also in understanding the ecosystem that you're engaging in, and then how these different aspects are sometimes working in parallel, as well as they are kind of clashing up against each other. That is one of the biggest things, is going around and doing the person-to-person side of it. And then bringing in these constituencies and these communities that generally don't talk.
From my experience, I would say a couple of things. One is, there'll be a lot of institutional resistance to even the best idea you can think of that actually works, and you can demonstrate. There'll be resistance to it. And I would say I probably experienced that more in the UN than anywhere else, but that was certainly true in a lot of environments. So that's one. So you have to have a kind of a sense of persistence and know it's going to be tough, and you may not get what you want, but keep pushing. And it may make it harder next time around. But if you are on pretty firm footing that this is useful and can work, I think that's one thing. Building the trust is really important. Just talking to people on a regular basis, and so they know you're not trying to. Maybe you're not necessarily trying to get them to adopt a new technology. You're not out there to try to get that information so that you can use it somewhere else for something that they may not have agreed to, like an investigation or something like that. So trusting that you're not, that, we used to get it as the 1540 committee would be, you're coming to see us, it's an inspection. Right. And it's like, no, that's not what we're trying to do. So, but that only comes from repeated engagement, I think. And then the third thing I think is important is recognize almost all of the emerging technologies, I agree, evolving technologies, I think might be a better way of saying it. They evolve in different paces in different places. So going back to early, I used to do a lot of work in China in the 90s, and including on their initial efforts to implement CWC. And they were going out to 5,000 different enterprises. And I'd frequently try to interview some of the bigger chemical enterprises in China. But I talked to their outreach people, because they did outreach at a provincial level and outreach at a local level. And they said, we have, because of things that happened in the past, we have mom and pop shops of 5 people where it really is difficult to talk about basic addition. And yet they're making, chemicals. So how, they can figure this out or that out, but they're at really different levels. And if you're thinking about prescribing something that's going to fit everything, even within one country, it can be really difficult to be very clear that someplace may be really evolved and maybe it's capped and would be ripe for this new technology. But there's another segment of the community where they're not going to be ripe for this new technology for a long time. Within the same community, within the same international, within the same domestic economic structure. So that would be the other thing. Just watch for that. So.
I guess I would just add also, just finding out who your partners are. I think, early on when you're starting, just to see who else could be somebody who can help you champion something. Because there's a lot of energies. If it's not just one, you have more than one, and you can help start thinking about innovative ways to bring more people on. So, who are the supporters to help you get moving? You have one more question? Oh, sorry, did you have a response?
I just wanted to add something that it's also very important to understand what the problems of the constituency are and figuring out solutions that actually make their life easier rather than complicating it, and showing that the solutions that we are proposing are solutions that work for the common good, and that, again, will not create additional hurdles, but as a matter of fact will help overcome those that exist.
Well, Noemi Zerbe, Chemical Sector Specific Agency with the Department of Homeland Security. Just wanting to do a couple of reality. Noemi Zerbe? Okay, sorry. I did. And just wanting to discuss a little bit about a couple of reality checks. I've been in this business since 2006. I spent 3 years detailed to the Infrastructure Security Compliance Division, and just came back to the Chemicals Sector Specific Agency. And one of the things that we encountered was the multiple names for the same chemical, which then creates issues from the operator point of view, that if he doesn't see on a list the particular specific name that he uses for his chemical, then he believes he's off the hook. So that has been one problem. We went with NAAC codes. We tried different approaches, and we're still trying to battle that issue of the multiple names for the particular one chemical. The other thing is that going from nuclear, which is a contained environment and space, if you compare it to chemical,
Get her another mic. Thanks.
So if you go from nuclear and something and a technology that works for nuclear, and you try to extrapolate that to chemicals when we have tens of thousands of chemicals, that you come to a point where my experience in bench chemistry, I would do something in bench chemistry at 1 gram and then try to extrapolate that to, you know, a ton, and I would get all sorts of inconsistencies from my lab, my bench, to the extrapolation. And I think that we face that as well, going from something that works very well for nuclear to extrapolate it to chemicals, because of the amount of chemicals that we would have to include into that tool or into that database, making it a little wildly, especially for our phone mechanisms that get a little bit limited. Then the one other thing that I think that reality check was, when we talk about quantities, and Kelly Murray did, she talked about screening thresholds, screening quantity thresholds, which is what CFATS is based on. You have a chemical at this amount, then you have, I mean, you create the law, you create the workaround. People work around that. Then they bring down their chemical holdings to 1 pound below that. So they're not covered by the regulation. They distribute their holdings to different little other companies around them, but it's not the same address. So then that gets them off of the regulatory arena. So all of these things, because we've already gone through that, and we're still trying to figure out how do you deal with that, things that we need to consider when we're trying to extrapolate these best practices to the international arena, where the culture is maybe not ready to be precise in their reporting of holdings, chemical holdings, and their reporting of their processes for that, and the chemical nomenclature. So there's a lot of things to be considered as we move forward, and I think that one place that I would love to start would be in a common nomenclature. Let's everybody talk about apples and know that we're talking about apples.
So I would address that, the point of the common nomenclature. The main fact is that chemicals are best described by structures, not by names. And so there is a simple solution to that. The solution is whenever you have a chemical name, that name needs to be converted to a structure and then compare that structure with what's in the database. And so the tool that we have in mind is a tool that would facilitate that. Because just going through a list of names, as you just mentioned, doesn't do anything. And that's a very, very big problem. I mean, it seems easy to just go through a list of chemical names and check whether or not your chemicals is part of that. But as you mentioned, there are so many synonyms, and you can write the same, especially if it's a large compound. You can write it in so many ways. And so, again, the solution is that chemicals are better identified by structures, not by names. And so if whenever you have a name, it's relatively straightforward to automatically convert that name into a structure, then it is that structure that you should compare to the list of chemicals of concerns. So developing tools that facilitate that, and especially tools that are accessible to operators that are not trained in chemistry, I think would be key.
Did you want to?
Yeah, and just I think a quick point about the transition from nuclear world. The International Atomic Energy Agency itself is facing an issue now because it is looking much more at, okay, we've talked about special nuclear materials and nuclear security, but what we've really not talked about until very recently is securing radioactive sources. Now there's a code of conduct on safety and security of radioactive sources that's older, but they just had their first conference, well, it closed a week ago Friday, and that in some ways is a better parallel to the chemical industry than the nuclear side, because the chemical industry, the radiological
on that. I disagree.
Okay, the radiological industry has way more stakeholders in terms of there's medical people, that there's medical companies, there's well logging companies, it can be a lot more mobile usually, and but that's certainly one of those issues that they're struggling. But in doing so, they're realizing they don't know the communities that are involved, and I think that's to some extent if we just isolate ourselves to kind of the traditional chemical weapons silo and the conditional nuclear silo, I think we may be missing out on something. There may be something to learn there. I would say one of the big takeaways I had from that meeting was John Buchanan of Interpol said on the opening day, at the end of the day, he said, I heard everybody talking about engaging law enforcement as stakeholders. Everybody was. He said, what incentive do they have to be a stakeholder? He said, their incentive is to go out and catch crooks. Well, otherwise they get pushed out. Other things get pushed out of the agenda if there's no crooks. And that means criminalizing things and putting something beyond just codes of conduct. You had to take a step out. And that may be a lesson in the chemical industry. I don't know. But there's a lot of interesting things, I think, that can be learned from some of these others. And we've got to be very careful about just saying, well, ours is so different. Maybe, it's not applicable what we could learn there. But let me stop there.
Just first of all, I didn't
very,
say
very briefly.
Yeah, I didn't say that on the nuclear side we've demonstrated that it works feasibly. So let's be clear about what actually was said up here. But distributed ledger technology is being used and tested and everywhere. So from diamonds to health records. I mean, the Estonian e-government is based on a distributed ledger system before it was called blockchain. So this is not something where it's just, picked up and then, well, nuclear might be doing it, so therefore chem should be doing it. This is not that at all. This is saying that there are some similarities, of course, when it comes to an international organization doing reporting requirements from its states. That would be similar. And we've already identified where that might be a benefit for where the technology could fit. But until we understand the user requirements, what are the challenges, what are the tracking issues? And to be honest, barcodes shouldn't matter then. So it's, what is understanding that ecosystem. Before you have the ecosystem, then it's just talk. So we need to know the talk, the user requirements and the ecosystem, and then from there, you can test it, and then we'll know. And that's where, by the way, if you fail, you fail. Sure. Then it doesn't work. Move on.
Great.
It's good something to learn. Yeah, you learn something.
You demonstrated it didn't work.
Sure.
All demonstration projects are successes because they demonstrate something.
Great.
Good point.
Well, I think we're going to have to end it there, so I think we're a little over time. But I want to thank all the panelists. Great presentation. I want to thank the audience for your participation. And I'm going to turn it back over to Rick.
Well, I'll do it from here since I'm still mic'd up. We've got one final little thing to do, and some of you entered this I actually saw this at the IAEA meeting, and we had hundreds of people coming in and saying, what was securing radioactive sources? What were the things that you learned or ideas? So we asked you to do something similar, especially with standards and practices and discussion. The first, so ice cream. Well, so we've got CFATs. The larger the word, that's the more time, the more time people in the audience entered that word. So and we've got industry, risk-based, accountability, public-private. So there was a lot of things at the same level as ice cream, and then CFATs. So maybe that's the notion that we can take away, is that there does need to be a champion and some leadership, and maybe you start from something, and maybe that's CFATs is where we start from. It doesn't mean that's where we end up or anything like that. But thank you all for participating, and we really this was really helpful for us, and you actually are contributing to our projects, and so I really appreciate it. And please go out and drive home safely or get home safely, and enjoy the evening here in DC for those of you who are visiting, and happy holidays. Thank you.
Hello.
I'll give you my card.